One, two, three.
Your face looks wonderful. I like seeing that tree. I remember the tree in the
I
background.
deliberately have a very bland backdrop. Exactly.
Well, hello and welcome to Dopey, the podcast on drugs, addiction, and dumb shit. My name is Dave, and I'm joined from the UK. He's simply knackered. He's a hardcore journalist. He's been on the show before. He has a book called Lost Connections. He had a book called Chasing the Scream. And now he has a book called Stolen Focus. I'm going to hold it up to really plug it up nice. And it's a beautiful book, Why You Can't Pay Attention and How to Think Deeply Again. His name is Johann Hari. Welcome back.
Hey, so happy to be with you, David. Cheers.
Yeah, man. This book, I often kiss my guest's ass, and I can live with it. I try to kiss my guest's ass in an honest way. This book really changed my life. The first thing this book did for me is it made me start reading again and enjoy it. You know, I'm in the middle of like the first third of the book, and you're talking about reading and what it does for the brain, and I was like, I got to read for fun again. And I reread Herman Hesse's Siddhartha because I just needed to feel light, and it did it. And then I read Stephen King on writing, and then I just finished the new David Sedaris book, and I'm just in it. And it was all thanks to Stolen Focus. It really helped me because I was so locked up in my screen addiction, and you being a journalist who's written extensively about addiction, this book is about why we can't pay attention, but you don't talk about screen addiction, which I found really interesting. And I wanted to see why you don't say we're addicted to screens.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the book obviously is about our problematic relationship with screens, but I don't use the word addiction. And I don't know that I have a very good answer to you, but let's think it through. So I wrote the book because I could feel that my own attention was getting worse with each year that passed. Things that require deep focus that are really important to me, like having proper long conversations, watching films, reading books, were just getting harder and harder. And I can see this happening to huge numbers of people around me. You know, the average American office worker now focuses on only one task for only 3 minutes. And for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when I was 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem. So, you know, it was difficult to talk about because at the start, I could see this problem. I was thinking about it for a long time. I thought I should write about this, should investigate it. But I thought, well, the reasons are obvious, so it's not very interesting. A, I'm just lacking in willpower. There's something wrong with me, right? I'm not strong enough. And B, someone invented the smartphone and that fucked me over, right? So those are not interesting stories to me. They're just depressing. But actually, when I started the research, I realized those stories were hugely oversimplified. But there was a kind of moment when I realized I had to write about it. Well, I think addiction is it's not the word I use, but I think would be a perfectly appropriate word to use. So I've got a godson, and when he was 9, he developed this brief and very intense obsession with Elvis Presley. And it was super cute because he seemed to genuinely not know that impersonating Elvis had become a cheesy cliche. So I think he was the last person in the history of the world to do an entirely sincere impression of Elvis doing Jailhouse Rock. And every night when I would tuck him into bed, he would get me to tell him the story of Elvis's life over and over again. Obviously, I skipped over the bit at the end where he shit himself to death on the toilet. And one night when I was tucking him in, I mentioned Graceland, where Elvis lived. And I said that people go and visit it. And his whole face lit up. And he said, "Wait, Johann, will you take me to Graceland one day?" And I was like, "Sure." The way you do with 9-year-olds, knowing next week it'll be Legoland or whatever. And he said, no, do you swear? Do you really swear one day you will take me to Graceland? And I said, I absolutely promise. And I didn't think of that moment again for 10 years until loads of things had gone to shit. So he dropped out of school when he was 15. And by the time he was 19, he spent, this is going to sound like an exaggeration, I promise you it's not. He spent literally almost all his waking hours alternating between his iPad, his iPhone, and his laptop. And it's like his life was this kind of blur of WhatsApp, YouTube, porn. And it felt when you talked to him like he was kind of whirring at the speed of Snapchat, where nothing still or serious could touch him. And one day we were sitting on my sofa here in London, and all day I was trying to get a conversation going with him, and I just couldn't, right? I just couldn't do it. And to be honest with you, I wasn't that much better, David, right? I was staring at my own devices. And I suddenly remembered this moment all these years before. And I said to him, hey, let's go to Graceland. And he looked at me completely blankly. He's like, what are you talking about? And I reminded him. And I said, look, this is no way to live. Let's break this numbing routine. Let's go on a road trip all over the South. But I thought ahead and I said, look, you've got to promise me one thing, which is that when you go, you'll leave your phone in the hotel, because there's no point in us going if you're just going to stare at your phone the whole time. And he took a beat and he really thought about it. And he said, you know what, you're right. I want to do this. So I think it was a fortnight later, maybe 3 weeks later, we took off from here to New Orleans, where we went first. And a couple of weeks later, we got to Graceland. And when you get to the gates of Graceland now, there's no one to show you around. What happens is they hand you an iPad and you put in earbuds, and the iPad shows you around. It says, go left, go right. Every room you're in, it tells you a story about that room. And every room you go in, there's an image of that room on the iPad in front of you as you walk around. So it has this slightly weird effect that everyone walks around Graceland just staring at the iPad, and they only really look away from it to take selfies and then go back to the iPad. I get a bit pissed off with this. And we got to the jungle room that was Elvis's favorite room in Graceland. It's got loads of fake plants in it. And I'll never forget this. There was a Canadian couple next to us. And the man turned to his wife and said, honey, this is amazing. Look, if you swipe left, you can see the jungle room to the left. And if you swipe right, you can see the jungle room to the right. And I laughed, right? I thought they were kidding. And I turned and watched them, and they were just kind of swiping back and forth. And I leaned forward and I said, but hey, sir, there's an old-fashioned form of swiping you could do. It's called turning your head, because you realize we're in the jungle room. You don't have to look at it on the internet. It's literally all around you. And they looked at me like I was fucking crazy and backed out the room. And I turned to my godson to laugh about it. And he was standing in the corner staring at Snapchat. Because from the moment we landed, he literally couldn't stop, right? He could not stop. And I went up to him. I did that thing that's never a good idea with teenagers. I tried to physically grab the phone out of his hand. And I said, look, I know you're afraid of missing out. I understand that. But this is guaranteeing that you'll miss out. You're not showing up at your own life. You're not present at the events of your own existence. This is no way to live. And he stormed off, understandably. And I wandered around Memphis on my own that day. And I found him that night at the Heartbreak Hotel, where we were staying up the street. And he was sitting, there's a big guitar-shaped swimming pool. And he was sitting there. And I went up to him and I apologized for getting so angry. And it was really interesting because he was looking at Snapchat. He didn't look up. But he said, I know something's really wrong and I don't know what it is. And that's when I thought, oh shit, I realized sort of we'd come away to get away from this problem of distraction, but there was nowhere to escape to because it was everywhere. It was the air we breathe. And I thought, well, I had to figure out what's going on here. And that was sort of how it began. And so you could well describe his behavior as an addiction. And as you know, I've always been persuaded by the evidence that what are called behavioral addictions are just as powerful as, drug and alcohol addictions.
Chemical.
Right? Yeah,
sure.
I wouldn't use, for reasons I can explain, I wouldn't use the word chemical, although I understand why you do. Go to a meeting of Gamblers Anonymous. I've been spending a lot. I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that happened in Las Vegas. So I've been spending a lot of time in Vegas, and go to any Gamblers Anonymous meeting in Vegas, I spent some time at the Problem Gambling Centre there, not because I've got a problem with that, but just to write about it. And they're as addicted as anyone in the Narcotics Anonymous meeting up the hallway, right? And I think that tells you something. It's interesting. Professor David Nutt. Have you ever interviewed David? Do you know him, David? You'd really like it. Oh, remind me, I'll introduce you to him. He's an amazing person. He was the chief scientific advisor on drugs here in Britain and was fired for telling the truth, basically. And it turned out to be a good thing for us because he's become a really wonderful voice on, well, always was, but it's become an even more wonderful voice on drug policy. But he said to me once, gambling addiction reveals something absolutely fundamental about the core of addiction, because you don't snort a roulette wheel, you don't inject a pack of cards, right? There's no physical dependency component to gambling addiction. I mean, often, they're also heavy drinkers or whatever, but the gambling addiction doesn't have that component. And that tells you something. And I think that's probably true of technology addiction as well. So I'm in favor of using the word addiction in relation to it. I think the honest answer is I talked and written about addiction so much that I thought there's a slightly different vocabulary to talk about this, which is entirely compatible with talking about it as an addiction, that I think sort of broadens it out a bit. I think addiction, because people have such a narrow understanding of addiction, in a way that I've tried to challenge and you challenge, but because people have such a narrow understanding of addiction, I sort of thought it was better to talk about it in this slightly more complicated way. Also, because one thing that most surprised me is I don't actually think technology is, when I started, I thought, I'm writing a book about tech, right? I ended up going on this big journey. I interviewed over 200 of the leading experts on attention and focus all over the world, from Moscow to Miami to Melbourne, not just the cities that begin with the letter M. And I learned that there's actually scientific evidence for 12 factors that can make your attention better or can make it worse. And loads of those factors have been hugely rising in recent years, and many of them are nothing to do with our technology. Some of them are absolutely parts of our technology. It's not all our tech. And some of them are just completely different things, like food. It never occurred to me that the food we eat would have so deeply affect our attention, or air pollution, or the way our offices work, or the way our schools work. And there's a whole array of factors. So yeah, that's a very long-winded way of giving a not very satisfactory answer to your question. I apologize.
I think it was a very, very satisfactory answer. And I think that this book, like I've been talking about Stolen Focus since I read it. I read it in December, and I've been talking about it on my show, on Dopey. I talk about it in Zooms. I talk about it all the time. And the introduction with you and your godson going to Graceland was so cinematic for me. And also just, I love the pilgrimage to Graceland, the Paul Simon song. Just as soon as you start talking about it, I hear the Mississippi Delta was shining like the national guitar. I hear the song, and there's a great mythology to the pilgrimage to Graceland. And I think the point is to experience life. Two young men from the UK to come to Graceland, a kitschy place, but an important place in American popular culture. And you guys are going to give up the screen for your godson and for yourself. But then you look at him and he can't stop. And I look at my daughter and she can't stop. And I feel so powerless and hopeless. And then I look at myself and I'm exactly the same way. And then you decide to go to Providencetown from that experience, right? And hearing your trip to Providencetown when you want, it's like getting sober. You were like, fuck this, I'm done, I need to sober up. And could you please tell that story? Because I found it to be like such a delight to hear your journey and what happened there.
Yeah, just to say about your daughter and about my godson. So it's tempting when people talk about this to get into a kind, I know this is definitely not what you're doing, a kind of, kids today kind of way of talking about it, right? As if there's something wrong with the kids. And the truth is, there's nothing wrong with our kids. There's something wrong with the environment, right?
Right.
It's called Stolen Focus because your attention didn't collapse. Your kid's attention didn't collapse. Your attention has been stolen from you by some very big and powerful forces. But once we understand those forces, we can begin to get our attention back to some degree as individuals and also as a society. But when I started thinking about the book, I didn't know any of that. I hadn't gone on this journey. I hadn't done this deep dive into the science. So I was still in this story of like, there's something wrong with me, right? And it's funny, I had this funny experience. One of the first experts I interviewed was this guy called Professor Roy Baumeister, who is a brilliant scientist. He's at the University of Queensland in Australia, and he's the leading expert in the world on willpower. If anyone listening knows something called the marshmallow test, it's a famous experiment. He's the guy who came up with that. He literally wrote a best-selling book called Willpower, right? So I go to interview him. I thought he'd be a good person to talk to about this. Go to interview him, and I said, I'm thinking of writing a book about why people are struggling to focus and pay attention, really interested in your perspectives, what we could learn from your science about this. And he said something like, the exact words are in the book. Oh, it's kind of interesting you say that, because I just find I can't really pay attention very much anymore. I play Candy Crush a lot on my phone. I'm sitting there thinking, fuck me. Fucking, didn't you write the book called fucking Willpower, right? I didn't say this to him, obviously, but I'm like, shit, if you can't pay attention, what fucking hope is there for the rest of us? But I actually learned that willpower is a very limited element of what's going on. It's not nothing. Willpower is a real thing, but it's a rather limited aspect of this. So I came back from Graceland, and I was in this sort of weird state of being horrified by what happened to my godson. And like a lot of revulsion, I was really appalled at myself, right? Much more than him. Although I love him and want him to have a good life. And I also had this weird thing where the book that we first met to talk about, Chasing the Scream, my book about addiction, was being made into a big Hollywood movie and into a documentary series by Samuel L. Jackson. The movie's called The United States versus Billie Holiday. And so I had a load of money, right? Which I never really had in my life before. And I thought, fuck it, why am I sitting here? I've got this money in the bank. Why am I fucking sitting here, not being able to focus, feeling miserable? I'm going to go away. So I thought, well, the problem is I don't have enough willpower, and someone invented the smartphone, so it seemed obvious. I'll use my willpower and separate myself from the smartphone. So I booked a beach house in Provincetown, a room in a beach house in Provincetown. And I announced to everyone, I'm going away for 3 months and I'm going to have no smartphone and no laptop that can get online, right? So my friend Imtiaz had a broken, battered old laptop that never been able to get online for years. So gave me that. And I was like, I'm out of here, right? And for people who don't know Provincetown, it's at the tip of Cape Cod. In fact, its unofficial tourist slogan is "Just the Tip," which I've always liked. And it's a gay kind of resort town. It's the kind of place where more than one person makes a full-time living by dressing as Ursula, the villain from The Little Mermaid, and singing songs about cunnilingus. It's a great place. And
well, I live across from Fire Island, so I'm very familiar with this kind of world.
I see. Yeah, I got in trouble on an Australian radio show because there's a kind of beach town in Australia called Byron Bay, and an interviewer said to me, "How would you explain to an Australian what Provincetown is?" And I said, "Well, if you picture Byron Bay with less surfing and more fisting, you've got the idea." They didn't realise we were live; they were absolutely horrified. But so Provincetown is a great place. And I went there, and I left my nice fancy laptop that I'm speaking to you on now in with my friend Shailene in Boston, and my smartphone. And it was a really fascinating experience. I'm almost certainly going to do it again this summer, the same thing in Provincetown. But how can I describe it? There were ups and downs, but it was kind of incredible. The thing that amazed me most was how much my attention came back. Because I also thought I was nearly 40 when I went. This was 2018. I thought, well, maybe I'm just getting old. And my attention quite quickly went back to being as good as it had been when I was 17 years old. I could read all day if I wanted to. I could really listen to people. I was stunned by how much my attention came back. I mean, there were some ups and downs there too that we can talk about, but I remember on the last day, there, after this like blissful 3 months, and I'd barely left Provincetown. I think I went to Hyannisport once to meet a friend of mine, but so there's a point at the edge of Provincetown where you can, in front of the what's it called? Basically where you can see the whole of Provincetown.
The
And
Lighthouse.
well, yeah, it's beyond the lighthouse. Actually, it's got a name. It's I can't remember what it's called, but it's you can look out over the whole of Provincetown. And looking at this whole place, I have to think, God, this has been so incredible. I'm never going to go back to how I lived before, right? Why would I go back to that? This has been incredible. And I got back my phone and my laptop. I think I had to go to Australia from there for something. And within a few months, I was 80% back to where I'd been. Not totally, but and then I was just really fucking depressed. And then I learned about the 12 factors that are actually doing this to us, many of which changed for me in Provincetown, not just not just the tech. And then I was like, okay, I need to learn more about these factors, A, to integrate them into my own life, and B, to figure out, wow, why is this playing out for so many people? And look, no one in my family could dream of taking 3 months away from the internet and just going on. And, you know, I couldn't have dreamed of it. I hadn't had the insane good fortune of my book being made into a film. And that's obviously not the solution for us all to kind of become kind of the equivalent of the gay Amish, right? That's not the answer. So I was like, well, what is the answer? And that's really the journey that the book then took me on.
Well, I want to hear about the answer, but I can't help but make that parallel between a drug addict who might try to pull a geographic, as it's called, and leave where the drugs are to go someplace and live in some pseudo paradise, right? And there's no drugs, and and he's free or she's free, and all of a sudden she feels good or he feels good. And then it all comes roaring back. There's parallels, like, to me,
Definitely.
which I love. And
even the cravings when I was there, David. I mean, I remember about a month, I can't remember the exact date, but 3 weeks a month into it, having had this blissful sense of relief, suddenly having these intense cravings. I remember one day walking down the beach that's just behind the west end of Provincetown and seeing all these people standing on the beach, just using Provincetown as a backdrop for selfies, basically, not looking at, and it's literally one of the most beautiful places in the world, right? It's a sandbar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. People not looking at anything except, you know, their own pictures of their own abs, basically. But instead of going like, oh, you know, this is no way to live, you know, all the things I said to my godson in Memphis, I wanted to grab the phones off them. I wanted to go, fucking give me that phone. I want to look at it, right? Let me check my social media. Let me see. And there's a very pretentious way of putting this, which is Simone de Beauvoir said that when she became an atheist, it was like the world had gone silent. And that's kind of how it felt, right? Like what happens, it turns out by design, we've become dependent on these constant signals throughout the day from social media that tell you, you know, I see you, you matter. Particularly, obviously, during the pandemic, it went, you know, massively spiked up, but we were hugely rising prior to the pandemic. And when that's gone, it's not immediately replaced by anything. No normal social interaction floods you with hearts, right? And so there was a period of really felt like things had gone silent. And I felt very disorientated and lost. And I was like, oh, okay, you've created a vacuum. Okay, this will feel very familiar to addiction narratives. You created a vacuum. Okay, now you need to replace that, fill that vacuum with meaning and purpose. And it's not enough to just take away the thing, right? You need to then figure out, well, what was this thing doing for me, and how can I find healthy ways to get that? So obviously, as you know, we've talked about before, I had a lot of addiction in my family, and still do. And
does that pop up in your head when you're in Provincetown and you're having a craving for kind of approval, a craving to be seen, heard, known, craving for the screen? Does any of that, the research, your family, addiction pop into your head and you're like, holy shit, maybe this is a thing?
It's really interesting. I'm trying to think about why. The honest answer is no. And I'm trying to think about why. And I don't know the answer, but it didn't. And I would still be although I do think addiction is a reasonable, behavioral addiction is a reasonable sort of way of talking about this problem. I don't know why it didn't. And it's not that I'm immune to applying that to myself. I have had times when I thought, oh, am I addicted to this? Or had a period when I was taking, I was in a kind of, well, I grew up in a very violent and crazy family, and my way of coping with that from when I was very young was to read and write all the time, which obviously worked out well for me in the end. But that coping mechanism, but and there was a time in my life in my sort of late 20s when I was really obsessively working and writing, and I started to take a drug called modafinil. I've written about this somewhere, but it's a narcolepsy drug. And I'm obviously not narcoleptic. Well, not obviously, but I'm not narcoleptic. And if you take it and you're not narcoleptic, you can stay awake longer. But obviously, that comes with the cost that you basically go a bit crazy after a while. So I wouldn't say I was addicted to that drug. But what I would say is that I was very driven by compulsive patterns of work, massive overwork as a way of not being present with distress, and that that took the form of then taking a drug to try to take that behavior as far as I could. And obviously I took it too far. And I don't recommend it to anyone, unless you're narcoleptic, obviously. So yeah, it's not that I'm immune to thinking about addiction frames in relation to myself, but I don't know, you're asking it, it's funny, usually when someone says you're asking a good question, funny enough, in an interview, that means you're not asking a good question, because you're asking a good question means in our parlance, you've asked me something I can't answer, which is actually what you don't want to do. But interestingly, you have asked a good question, because it's something it's a fertile topic that I don't know the answer to in a way that's interesting, and I don't quite know why. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, like I'm horrible at Twitter. You know what I mean? Like I don't have enough followers.
That's because you're a nice person, and basically the only people who are good at Twitter are cunts, right? Let's be candid. I'm sorry, Andrew, careful about using that word. That's a British person can use that word in a way Americans don't.
No, I appreciate it. We use the word cunt as much as possible on Dopey, so I feel good about that. But I remember, like, I was trying to, like, because I want those likes, man. I want people to like what I say, and I want people to give me hearts and think I'm smart and funny. And then, like, Jamie Lee Curtis tweets, Stevie Wonder is a genius, and 30,000 people like her, and I write, I like Ray Charles, and nobody cares. and it's like, so I think that you've built up this career, this body of work that you get flooded with hearts. So like when you're in Providence Town, you're like, where is this? What happened? Why am I not getting it? And I think that's just a really interesting vacuum. It's almost part of your work comes with acclaim, and acclaim comes with this approval.
Well, but praise is, I would actually say, I haven't looked at my social media for many years. I mean, it sounds very grand, but I've got an assistant, I give it to her to do. But actually, if you said to me, Johann, I'm going to force you to look at it, do you want to see the praise or do you want to see the people slagging you off? I would hate to see either, but actually I think it'd be psychologically healthier to see the criticism. Not because the criticism is right, it's mostly just people being horrible and mean. But praise, I actually think, is as if not more destabilizing to the self as
criticism.
As criticism, because I don't mean praise from people you know. I don't mean real world praise. That's hugely valuable, right? Someone says, "Oh, remember that time you did that thing that helped me." That's good, healthy praise. But yeah, it just all knocks you off and destabilizes you, which is why I did, after that sort of crash, and when I was rebuilding a sense of a kind of more coherent and healthy sense of self, I felt much better. I mean, I felt much better, and I feel much better for not looking at that stuff now.
Yeah, if I get 1,000 reviews and 999 are good and one is bad, I'm only in the bad one. you know.
Interesting you say that, because this is a very well documented psychological phenomenon called negativity bias. And it actually is playing a really important role in one of the ways social media is fucking us up, fun enough. So how do I explain it? It's not just, so obviously most of my book is about how our individual attention is being destroyed, right? And what's causing that and what we can do about it. But it's also that our collective attention is being destroyed. You can see this most obviously in what's happening to our democracies, right? It's not a coincidence. All over the world, we're having the biggest crisis of democracy since the 1930s, at the same time as we're having all these attentional problems. And if you want to understand why, negativity bias, what you're describing, is a bit part of it. And if it's okay, I'll just pull back and explain it. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley interviewing the people who design key aspects of the world in which we now live. And it was fascinating to see how sick with guilt and shame they feel. There's a wonderful person called Dr. James Williams, who'd been at the heart of the creation of Gmail and other aspects of Google. And one day he was speaking at a tech conference, and the audience is literally the people that your daughter, like people who design the stuff your daughter uses. And he said to them, if there's anyone here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, please put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand, right? And he quit and became, I would argue, the most important philosopher of attention in the world. But what people in Silicon Valley kept explaining to me, and it took me a while to understand, because in a way it seemed almost too simple to explain to me, anyone watching, anyone listening, if you open Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, any of them now, those apps begin to make money out of you immediately in two ways. First way is really obvious. You see advertising, okay, everyone knows how that works. Second way is much more important. Everything you do on these apps is scanned and sorted by their artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what makes you tick. So let's say that you've said you like, I don't know, Donald Trump, Bette Midler, and you told your mom you just bought some diapers. Okay, it's going to figure out if you like Donald Trump, you're probably right-wing. If you like Bette Midler and you're a man, you're probably gay. No disrespect to any straight men who like Bette Midler. I frankly don't believe you. And if you bought some diapers, okay, you've got a baby, right? If you've been on these apps for any amount of time, it has got tens of thousands of pieces of information like this about you. And it's gathering that information for several reasons, but the main one is because it wants to figure out what will keep you scrolling. For a very simple reason. Every time you open the app, or every time your kid opens the app and begins to scroll, they begin to make money because you see ads and they harvest more information about you. And every time you close the app, or your kid closes the app, that revenue stream disappears. So all of this genius in Silicon Valley, all of these algorithms, all of this AI, it's all geared towards one thing, figuring out how do we get you to open the app as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. That's it, right? That's all they're trying to do. Just like the head of KFC, all he cares about is how often did you go to KFC this week and how big was the bucket you bought? That's it. All they care about is how often and how long did you scroll. So they are constantly developing ever more sophisticated methods to get you to keep scrolling. And so they set up their algorithms to just figure out, well, what keeps people scrolling, right? What keeps people scrolling? What works, right? And they don't care what it is. They just want to keep you scrolling. They don't care what the specific thing is. So they're running this huge experiment on all of us. And they discovered, and it's what this wasn't their intention. They didn't design it. They didn't set out to do this, but they bumped into truth about human psychology. It's actually been known about for a very long time. It's what you're describing. It's called negativity bias, that human beings will stare longer at things that make us angry and upset than we will at things that make us feel good, right? You will remember the one bad review out of the 999 good reviews. If you've ever seen a car accident on the motorway, you stared longer at the mangled car wreck than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the street. This is very deep in human nature. 10-week-old babies stare longer at an angry face than a smiling face. It's probably for good reason in our evolution. Our ancestors who weren't looking out for the one dangerous thing probably got eaten and didn't get to be our ancestors. Is a slightly crude way of putting it, but you see what I mean, right? So that's a part of human nature, always has been. But when you combine it with algorithms that are constantly priming you, it has a horrendous effect. So the way to picture it is, picture two teenage girls who go to the same bus, so go to the same party and go home on the same bus. And one of them does a TikTok video where she goes, oh, what a great party. We danced all night to Ariana Grande. We had such fun, loved it. And the other girl does a video where she opens it and goes, Karen was a fucking skank at that party and her boyfriend's a prick, and just does an angry denunciation of everyone at the party, right? The algorithms are scanning for the kind of language you use, and it'll put the first video into a few people's feeds, but it'll put the second video into far more people's feeds. Because if it's enraging, it's engaging. What do you mean Karen's a skank? You're a fucking skank, right? You can see how it would work, right? I'd like to think you're finding what I'm saying interesting, but if someone next to you started having a fight, you would turn and watch that fight, right? So that's bad enough at the level of two teenage girls on a bus where the algorithms are promoting the meanest, cruelest comments and muffling the nicest ones. But now imagine that entire dynamic being applied to a whole society where the kind, decent people are muffled and pushed to the back, and the angry, cruel people are pushed to the front. Except you don't have to imagine it. We've been fucking living it for the last 10 years, right? We all know about, I mean, it's so obvious you don't even need me to tell you, right? So that dynamic, it's one of the many dynamics that are harming our individual attention. Obviously, the book is primarily about our individual attention and the ways that it's being harmed and the way our kids attend. A lot of it's about our kids. But it's also profoundly harming our collective attention, right? And we can't listen to each other anymore. We can't talk to each other. We just scream abuse at each other all the time. Funnily enough, I think addiction spaces are probably the last, some of the last, not the last, but some of the last spaces in the United States where people with very different politics still talk to each other in a spirit of love and compassion, right? I mean, churches.
Yeah, that's what you want it. You want it to be like that. I go to a 12-step meeting that's not particularly politically aligned with me, and it doesn't come out at all. You know, the only thing that comes out is how do we stay sober and how do we try to do the next right thing. When I hear you talk about this, though, it makes me think two things. First thing is like, what kind of negative shit can I put out there so more people pay attention to Dopey? I got to figure that shit out. And the second thing, it's one of my favorite parts in the book. When you talk about this and you talk about the potential Facebook or Instagram or Twitter has to provide some kind of goodness to the consumer, like a Facebook that does good. Can you explain that whole thing? I love that part.
Well, one of the things that, so the way big tech want us to think about this is, are you pro-tech or are you anti-tech, right? And when you hear that, you're like, look, I'm not going to join the Amish. Even someone like me, which probably stand had this great time, I'm not going to do that for the rest of my life, right? So you go, well, I must be pro-tech, I guess, right? And that's not a debate. We're all pro-tech, apart from the Amish. No disrespect to them. If they're listening, you are sort of cheating if you are, but never mind. The debate is what tech, designed for what purposes, working in whose interests. At the moment, we are using tech that is designed to work against us in the interests of a tiny number of billionaires who profit from us having fucked up attention. But we could have tech designed to work for us. And there's a historical analogy that you're going to remember. I think we're about the same age, aren't we, David? How old are you?
I think I'm a couple of years older than you. I'm 48.
Right, I just turned 44. So you'll remember this, right? I remember it. A lot of people listening will remember it. When we were kids, the dominant form of gasoline in the US, all over the world, was leaded gasoline, right? And a little bit before our time, people used to paint their homes with leaded paint. And it was discovered that exposure to lead is really bad for your brain, and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention. So what happened, and obviously if it's in gasoline, it's in the air, everyone was breathing it in. If it's in paint, the same. So what happened was a group of ordinary moms banded together, these people who used to call themselves housewives, and said, well, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing these companies to fuck up our kids' brains? This is crazy. And it's important to notice what they didn't say. So they didn't say, so let's ban all paint, let's ban all petrol, right? They didn't say that, right? They said, let's deal with the specific elements in the gasoline and the paint that are screwing up our kids' brains and move to a version that doesn't do this. And, you know, these moms, they fought like hell for their children. And it followed the kind of classic pattern of all political struggles described by Gandhi. First, they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. Everyone watching knows, ain't no more leaded paint, no more leaded gasoline. As a result, the Centers for Disease Control has calculated that the average American child is 3 to 5 IQ points higher than it would have been had we not band led. So great model for me. There's something in this stuff that we use that's fucking up our attention. Let's get rid of it and replace it with something that doesn't fuck up our attention, right? And lots of my friends in Silicon Valley, people I got to know, said, okay, that's what we need to do. And it took me quite a long time to understand it. So the business model we have at the moment, there's basically 3 possible business models for social media, right? The one we have at the moment, the fancy term for it is surveillance capitalism, a term that's coined by the brilliant Professor Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard. Surveillance capitalism is where basically you get it for free, in inverted commas, but in return, they track you, they secretly surveil you, they hack your attention and sell it to the highest bidder. So it comes at a really fucking big cost. It comes at the cost of your attention, right? That's one model. It's the model we've got now. But the 2 alternative models, everyone watching will have some experience of, almost certainly. So the first one is subscription. We all know how HBO and Netflix work, right? You pay a certain amount and in return, you get access. Now, the important thing about that is it completely changes the dynamics. You are not the customer of Facebook or TikTok. You are the product they sell to the real customer, the advertisers, right? So Facebook and TikTok have a customer service line. You can't phone it. I can't phone it, right? Because we're not the customer, right? But suddenly, in a subscription model, you are the customer. Suddenly, they have to ask not, how do we hack and invade David in order to sell his attention to the highest bidder? They have to ask, oh, what does David want? Turns out David feels good when he meets up with people face to face instead of fucking doom scrolling through their pictures. Okay, let's design our app to facilitate that. Let's start to tell him, oh, this friend has indicated that he's nearby and would like to go for a coffee. Oh, great, let's go for a coffee, right? Very easy to do. It could be designed to heal your attention, not to hack it. So that's one model. Another model is one that literally everyone has experience of. In fact, everyone has experience of in their homes. Think about the sewers. Before we had sewers, we had shit in the streets, people got cholera, it was fucking awful. So we all paid to build and maintain the sewers together, right? And we all own the sewers together. Anyone listening, you own the sewers in the city where you live, along with the other people who live there. I own the sewers in the city where I live, right? Now, it might be that like we want to own the sewage pipes together because we don't want to get cholera. We might want to own the information pipes together because we're getting the equivalent of cholera for our attention, and I would argue for our politics, right? But whichever of these 2 alternatives you choose, and I want to stress, if it was public ownership, it would have to be independent of the government, for really obvious reasons. You don't want the government controlling this. So a good model would be the BBC here in Britain, which is everyone who owns a television set in Britain pays a certain license fee, and that funds the BBC, and the BBC works for us, but it doesn't work for the government, right? It's not perfect, but it is the most trusted media organization in the whole world, so it's doing something right, right? But the key thing is we've got to change the incentives, because the way I think about it, with all of these 12 factors that I write about in Stolen Focus that are harming our attention, from the food we eat, to the way our offices work, to the air we breathe, you've got to have, the way I think of it is we're in a race, right? On one side of the race, you've got these 12 factors, many of which are poised to become more powerful, right? Paul Graham, one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, said the world will be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is to your daughter than Facebook, right? Now imagine the next crack-like iteration of TikTok in the metaverse, right? That's one side of the race. On the other side of the race, there's got to be a movement of all of us saying, hell no, you don't get to do that to me. You don't get to do that to my children. We don't accept this. That is not a good life. We choose a life with plenty of tech, of course, but a life where we can think deeply, where our children can play outside, where we can read, right? If we want that, we can get it. I went to places that have made massive strides in restoring people's attention, from France to New Zealand, in very targeted and practical ways. There is loads we can do on this, but you don't get what you don't fight for, right? And it requires a shift in psychology. We need to stop blaming ourselves. There are loads of things. In my book, I talk about things we can do as individuals, and there are lots of them. We can talk about them. and things that we can do as a society, which will only happen if we all fight for them. But it also requires a shift in psychology. We need to realize we are not medieval peasants begging at the court of King Zuckerberg and King Musk for a few little crumbs of attention from their shitty table. You know, we are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds. And together, if we're willing to fight for them, we can take them back.
I love that. And I think, you know, one of the other things in the book that made me feel there's so many things in this book that just made me feel good and hopeful. Considering all of the gloom and doom that you could take out of it, the fact that I walked away from this book feeling really hopeful and knowing that I could make some different tweaks in my life to think deeper and to enjoy my life better. One of the phrases in the book that really just it exploded my mind was flow state. And I was actually listening to you talk about it again today, and I was thinking how flow state could really help addicts. You know, like when an addict can, I mean, like I think when an addict is newly sober, the phone is a great friend because it's a distraction. But when they get a little bit of time, the phone becomes an obsession. And how do they get into a flow state? How does anyone get into a flow state? And what is flow states versus what we're talking about?
So, flow states are the deepest form of attention that human beings can provide, and everyone listening will have experienced one, even if they don't know that term. So a flow state is when you're doing something and you just really get into it. And it's like time falls away and your ego falls away. And when it's over, you're like, whoa, that went quickly, right? And different people get into flow doing different things. For me, it would be writing. For some people, it would be making bagels. For some people, it'd be brain surgery. It can be whatever it is. One rock climber said, when you're climbing a rock and you get into flow, it's like you are the rock you're climbing, right? And flow is really important for understanding attention for a few reasons. It's the deepest form of attention that humans can provide. And once you get into it, it's the easiest form of attention to provide, right? It's not like, I don't know, memorizing facts for an exam, like, oh shit, what year did the Civil War begin or whatever? It's not like that, right? It comes very easily. So obviously I was very interested. If this is a deep gusher of attention that exists inside all of us, where do you drill to get it, right? How do you get there? So I went to interview an amazing man named Professor Mahali Csikszentmihalyi. You have no idea how long it took me to learn how to say that, who is the scientist who, starting in the mid-60s, discovered flow states. I think I did the last interview he ever did because he sadly died not long afterwards. And he discovered a huge number of things about flow. I think there's 3 things that I think would be particularly helpful to people if you want to maximize your chances of getting into a flow state. So the first is, you've got to set aside a good amount of time to pursue one goal. I want to paint this canvas. I want to read this book. If you're being interrupted, if you're answering text messages, if you're trying to do 2, 3, 4 things at a time, you won't get into flow. Secondly, you've got to choose a goal that is meaningful to you. Attention evolved to attach to meaning. A frog will stare longer at a fly than it will at a stone because the fly is meaningful to the frog and the stone is not, right? So you have to choose something that's meaningful to you. Often when your attention is slipping and sliding off of things, it can be a sign that what you're trying to do is not actually meaningful to you and you don't want to do it. Thirdly, this was counterintuitive to me when I first learned it. It will really help if you choose to do something that's at the edge of your abilities, but not beyond it. So let's say you're a rock climber, a medium talent rock climber. You don't want to just climb over your garden wall. It's too easy and that won't get you into flow. Equally, you don't want to suddenly try and climb Mount Everest. It's going to be too much. You want to climb a slightly higher and harder rock face than the one you did before. So flow begins at the edge of your comfort zone, right? At the edge of it, but not beyond it, which is a difficult balance to get, and you have to judge it a bit. But so if you do these 3 things, you choose one goal and set aside a significant amount of time to pursue it without being interrupted. You make sure it's a meaningful goal for you and you push yourself to the edge of your abilities. You hugely maximize your chances of activating this deep form of attention that we all have within us. So yeah, it's a great thing. Sorry, David, I should say I should go in about 5 minutes because my brain is completely failing, but I'm in the opposite of flow, but I'm so fucking tired. But yeah.
I'm sorry. The other thing that I want
to tell you a funny thing related to addiction? Can I tell you a funny thing related to addiction that happened to me not that long ago? I was in a taxi here in London, and a taxi driver said to me, I recognize you. And I said, I don't think you do. And he said, no, I recognize you. It's like, I really don't think you do. He said, you're an actor, aren't you? I'm like, I'm not an actor. And for the whole fucking journey, he's trying to guess what actor I am, right? And naming increasingly bizarre. Then he goes, I know who you are. And I said, who am I? He said, you're Philip Seymour Hoffman, aren't you? And I said, well, I'm not Philip Seymour Hoffman for several reasons. Firstly, because he was about 15 years older than me. But secondly, and most importantly, because he has been dead for like 10 years now. Like, no, I'm not. Anyway, sorry. I don't know why I just thought of that, what you were saying. But.
I understand. That's the worst. One interesting thing though, is that we live in the town where they do that let it grow thing, that let grow study.
One of my favorite
and my daughter, yeah, her health teacher is that lady.
You're kidding.
No, my daughter just did the Let It Grow project and she made waffles for us and made the video. And that woman is my daughter's favorite teacher. And when I was in health, all they talked about was scabies and herpes and fucking, like sexually transmitted diseases. In Nora's class, they talk about flow state and play and achievement. And it's like, it blew her mind. And
you mean Jodie Marici? Is that?
Yeah, Jodie
what a
Marici.
wonderful person. Lovely. I love Jodie. What a great person. If people don't know what we're talking about, a lot of the book is about why our kids can't focus and pay attention. And it turns out when you deprive children of free play, where they're playing without adults standing over them, it really stunts their ability to learn how to focus and pay attention for lots of reasons. One is a no shit Sherlock one, exercise. You let kids run around, their attention's much better. But another one is when children play without adults standing over them, they take risks. You climb a tree, you get too high, you shit yourself, but you find your way down. You didn't die, right? And taking those risks is really essential. Facing those small challenges without adults telling you what to do is really essential for you to not be anxious, because it's how you get a sense of yourself as a competent person, right? Oh, I took this little challenge, I dealt with it, I'll take the next little challenge. That's how you get a sense that you are a person who can do things in the world. If you take that away from children, they're really anxious and that fucks up their attention. So what the program that David's talking about does, an amazing program, and everyone with kids I really recommend go to it. It's letgrow.org, run by my friend Lenore Skenazi. What they do is they go to whole schools and whole neighborhoods and persuade everyone to give their kids increasing levels of independence that usually build up to playing outside, which massively restores attention. There's lots of things we've got to do. There's loads of individual things we can do to protect and restore our attention. And I go through dozens of them in the book. And there are loads of bigger things we can do. And restoring human childhood is one of them, I think.
Wow, it's an incredible book. I really appreciate your time. I'm sorry it's so late in England.
And do you know what? Normally I'm a nocturnal person. It's just that I've been massively overdoing it. The book came out in Spain and loads of other countries, and so I've been doing an absolute fuck ton of. It's partly why I'm very sweary. I become quite sweary when I'm. Partly gets from my mother. My mother's from Glasgow in Scotland. If you said to my mother, "How do you get to the post office from here?" she'd say, "So go at this door, go left 2 blocks. You'll see a bunch of cunts standing there. Go right where they are. Well, done another 3 blocks, you'll see a bunch of cunts standing there. That's the post office." So I've become very sweary. But anyway, so I've just been overdoing it. I've been doing too much and I am exhausted. But in Spain, I'm directly underneath Prince Harry on the bestseller list. I've always wanted to be directly underneath Prince Harry. This is not quite the way I imagined it, but happy days. Well,
that was what I was going to read. I was going to read the irony of your tweet, which was, whoop, whoop. I just found out my book, Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention, is the second best-selling nonfiction book on the weekend's bestseller list, under Prince Harry. And what gay man doesn't want to be under Prince Harry?
Exactly.
Johann, you
no
are a hero to
Meghan.
me. Oh, dude, whatever. I don't even think about it. When
I
you
feel that
come
she
to
would
New York, she would, with you, of course. Are you kidding? When you come back to New York, promise me that we can get together and record.
Of course. Hooray, we'll hang. Brilliant.
And I'll get you a pastrami sandwich.
You have no idea how many. You see, at least one of my chins is due to pastrami sandwiches. You have no idea how much I love them. They're popular.
Johann, thank you so much for doing it. Thank you even more so for the book. My wife also went to Stony Brook yesterday to see Frances Hager the whistleblower lady,
Oh yeah,
speak.
amazing person, Frances Hogan. Yeah,
And you have impacted my family. And
Oh.
obviously, I'm one person, so you've impacted so many people out there. But our family has really been impacted by this. So I
Oh.
really want to thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Cheers, David. I'm going to go and sleep for 1,000 years.
My daughter does want to kill you, but thank you because
okay.
you know how it goes. She'll thank you later.
She doesn't need to come when we go for the pastrami sandwich. Okay.
Get good rest. Thank you so much, Johann.
Cheers, David. Thanks so much. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
You'll never be alone. Now it's time for the Dopey Show.
Dopey, I'm face down on the floor. Dopey, please sir, can I have some more?